Chapter 18. Selden led them out of the large audience hall to a small chamber set to one side. There was a low central table surrounded by thick, comfortable cushions. Arched, unglazed windows looked out onto a shaded veranda, while a low moving fan, obviously kept in motion by an unseen servant, swung back and forth overhead, keeping a cool breeze circulating through the room. Sella then gestured for them to sit. This time, Will realized, there was no position of power for the Wakir. He sat on the same level as his guests. Two of his soldiers remained in the room, standing impassively to either side of the door. At a signal from one, servants emerged through a far archway and placed bowls of fruit on the table, along with a coffee pot and small cups. Evelyn hid a smile as she saw the three rangers' eyes light up at the sight of the last items. "My apologies for the play-acting outside," Sella then said smoothly. He looked slightly amused by the whole proceedings, Will thought. Evelyn showed no sign of any reciprocal amusement. "Was it really necessary?" she asked coldly, and Sella then inclined his head. "I'm afraid I felt it was, Your Highness," he said. Evelyn went to speak, but he continued. "You must appreciate that I need to be sure that I'm dealing with someone who has the full power to negotiate. After all, I expected Svengal here." He nodded toward the Scandian, who was trying to make himself comfortable sitting cross-legged on a cushion, "to return some months hence with a ransom money. A delegation from Erlunen arriving so soon and apparently acting on his behalf was definitely a surprise. I suspected a trick." His gaze flicked to Svengal again. "No offense," he added, and the Scandian shrugged. If he had been able to think of a worthwhile trick to release Erak, he would have tried it. "You had my seal," Evelyn told him. Surely that was proof enough. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. Sella then inclined his head thoughtfully. "I recognized the seal, of course, but I knew nothing of the person who carried it. After all, a seal can be stolen or even copied. I was faced with the prospect of negotiating with a young woman. I need to be sure that you were the real princess. That's why I had Armand impersonate me. I knew you'd probably see through the deception, but if you were planning trickery of your own, you'd pretend to go along with it. Only a real princess would have the courage and dignity to call my bluff and walk out as you did." He smiled at Halt. "Your princess has a strong nerve. She'd make a great Aridi." "She makes a great Erluin," Halt replied, and the queer acknowledged the statement. Then he rubbed both his hands together and smiled eagerly. "So now, perhaps we can negotiate," he said. The haggling took most of the rest of the morning. Sella then returned to his base figure of 80,000 reals. Evelyn countered with an offer of 45,000. When he gave her a hurt look and pointed out that earlier she'd begun at 50,000, Evelyn told him that he had tried to trick her, and her dignity now demanded a lower figure as a starting point. The bargaining continued. Sella then raised the fact that keeping Erak guarded and cared for had already cost his province a considerable amount of money. Those soldiers could have been gainfully employed elsewhere, he told her. The Tungali bandits raid our villages constantly. Halt looked up at the name. Crowley's briefing to him had relied on intelligence that was over a year old. He had been under the impression that the Tungali, a wild tribe of desert bandits and robbers, had been successfully suppressed. Apparently, if the Wakir was to be believed, they had regained some of their traditional strength. It was a fact worth knowing, he thought, unless it was just a bargaining ploy on Seladent's part. Evelyn expressed her sympathy for the expenses incurred, but her tone left no doubt that she was less than concerned about it. In reply, she countered that the expense of her trip to Arida and the cost of maintaining her own retinue. "Very few expeditions enjoy the presence of 3 rangers," she said. "Their skills are very much in demand in my homeland." It was Seladin's turn to react to a word. His eyes narrowed thoughtfully as she said rangers. He knew there was something about these 3 cloaked men. They had the appearance of simple woodsmen, archers, or hunters. Yet there was an air of self-assurance about all of them, and the older one, the princess's personal advisor, spoke with a depth of authority that one would never expect from a simple archer. Rangers. Yes, he had heard the term. There were rumors about the Heirloom Rangers, stories told by seafarers who had visited their country. They were vague and unsubstantiated, and doubtless exaggerated, to be sure, but enough to make him look at them with renewed interest. Let it be remembered that your friend and ally came here as a raider, he said. He planned to rob Al-Shabaab's treasury. His subtle use of the words friend and ally conveyed a vague implication that the kingdom of Heirloom had given some kind of tacit approval of Erak's raiding. It gave him a step up on the moral high ground. There must be some penalty exacted for that intention. Evelyn conceded the point. She could hardly do otherwise. She countered with the fact that nothing had actually been stolen, but Celadon had won that round, and she was forced to raise her bid to 55,000. He said he would consider, mind you, a sum of 78,000. And so it went on. Celadon was clearly enjoying the process. Bargaining was a matter dear to any Iridi's heart, and, after a while, to her own surprise, Evelyn found she was enjoying herself as well. The man was charming and good-humored. It was impossible to take offense, and she had to admit that he was very handsome, in an exotic, swashbuckling fashion. Eventually, they reached a tentative agreement. The figure was 66,480 reals of silver, to be paid in the form of a warrant on the Sicilian Council. The odd figure of 408 reals was reached when Celadon complained that the Sicilians would take their commission from the end figure. The fact that the delivery of silver was absolutely guaranteed allowed him to give a little on the figure, but she still resented the commission. He wrote the final amount on a parchment and nodded several times. "I will consider this for the next hour," he said. He rose, offering his hand to Evelyn to assist her. Even though she was as light and athletic as a cat, she took it, enjoying the contact. She saw Horace's slight frown as she did, and smiled to herself. A girl can never have too many admirers, she thought. Will, she noted, seemed unperturbed by the fact that she retained hold of Celadon's hand a little longer than politeness dictated. But then, rangers were trained to look imperturbable. He was probably seething with jealousy, she thought. The others rose to their feet as well, Svengal grunting as he heaved his bulk upright. "I will have you escorted back to the guest house," Celadon told her. "I will bring you my answer in an hour's time." In spite of the delay, she knew that the figure would be accepted. Halt had told her before they had left the guest house that the facade of considering it for an hour was simply a part of a rigid bargaining. She smiled and bowed her head. "Thank you, Excellence. I look forward to your decision." Back at the guest house, they sat around a table in the courtyard. Svengal shook his head impatiently. "Why do they have to go through all this rigmarole?" he asked. "We know they're going to accept the figure. They know they're going to accept it. Why not just say so and be done with it?" "It's a kind of compliment," Holt told him. "It makes it seem as though you've driven such a hard bargain that they can't accept it immediately. They have to appear reluctant. They enjoy subtleties like that." Svengal snorted. Like most Scandians, he preferred the direct approach. The tortuous intricacies of diplomacy left him cold. Gillen grinned. "I like the subtle implication that we were somehow involved in the raid." Halt nodded. "You mean the reference to our being a friend and ally?" "It was a nice touch." Svengal was still annoyed over what he saw as an unnecessary waste of time. In addition, he was bored, tired of behaving diplomatically and looking for an argument to pass the time. "Well, in a way, he's right. All of this is partly your fault, you know," he said. Halt leaned forward in his chair, eyebrow raised. "Our fault?" Svengal made a vague gesture. "Yes. After all, if it hadn't been insisted that we stop raiding in your country, we would never have been here in the first place. Pardon me if I disagree, Evelyn said. You surely can't be trying to blame us for Erak's habit of charging ashore, waving an axe, and grabbing everything that isn't nailed down. She realized what she had said, and that it might not sound a little harsh. So she added with a note of apology, No offense, Svengal. Svengal shrugged. None taken. It's a pretty accurate description of Erak on a raid, as a matter of fact. But the point remains. Whatever the point might have been was never made clear, as a servant appeared at the moment, informing them of Saladin's arrival. The Wakir followed a few meters behind, smiling as they rose from their chairs around the table. Agreed, he said, as they were all smiles around the table. That's wonderful, Excellence, Evelyn told him. I have a warrant against the Sicilian Council in my baggage. All I need is for the amount to be filed here and me to add my seal. We can do that straight away. Saladin nodded contentedly. Whatever it's convenient, Your Highness, he said. There's no hurry. Fortunately, there would be no problem with both sides understanding the warrant. The Sicilian Council's warrants were well known throughout the area, and although Araluan and Aridi used a different written language, both nations used the same numbering system. The figure agreed and signed by Evelyn would be unmistakable. I'm sure Erak won't agree. When will we be able to see him and give him the news? Saladin hesitated. Yes. We will bring him to you, he said. Today? Halt asked, noting a tone of hesitation in the other man's voice. Perhaps it might take a little longer than that, Saladin said. Halt looked at him suspiciously. How long? He said very deliberately. Saladin gave him his most disarming smile. Halt remained resolutely undisarmed. 4 days, perhaps 5, Saladin said. Evelyn and Halt exchanged exasperated glances. Where exactly is he? The princess asked Saladin. There was a definite cutting edge to her voice, Will thought. Saladin seemed to agree. His disarming smile became a little less confident. On his way to the fortress at Mararak, he said. It's 4 days on a good horse.